Welcome to the 6 Feet Apart podcast, the conversation designed to help us find our way when answers seem out of reach and life doesn't make sense. We're Luke and Ben, and we'd like to thank everyone for joining us for episode 7.
This podcast is a place to sort through tough questions, and we want to be particularly helpful to those who maybe have some serious questions or doubts about God and the Christian faith. And if you know someone who might be interested in these kind of conversations, we'd love it if you'd share this video.
And remember, we'd love to hear some questions that you might have. You can send them in to 6feet@mountaincc.org. We'll do what we can to get to some of those in the weeks ahead. But today we're continuing a multi-part conversation about suffering and evil. How do we make sense of those things, especially alongside certain claims about God? And we already knew when we started talking about this that it was a relevant thing. We've seen the suffering that's been created by the coronavirus all over the world. And even before that, all of us have our own experiences. We know we live in a world filled with pain, and you might be a person that feels like you've gotten more than your fair share. And then you add to that what's happened over the last few weeks. The pain and evil has been compounded by acts of injustice and the ensuing turmoil. It's been incredibly hard to bear. And so we're trying to get through it. And clearly, this is much more than just an intellectual challenge or some philosophical puzzle to solve. We all feel it very deeply. And that's informed our approach that we're taking here. So, and Ben, maybe to start without doing a full review, but I think it is important to remind everyone of our posture and where we've started. So that gives some context for the next steps that we want to take today.
Yes, I mean, that I think it's wise, Luke. The whole subject matter of suffering and evil is so monumental, and part of that's because it's so personal and so real. And so we started by just saying what Luke is pointing out there. Before we dive into the philosophical, we've got to just deal with the fact that maybe the best thing we need to do is, before we try to worry about the answer and settle for some trite cliche that inevitably someone's going to throw out there, that really just sort of ends up glossing over the human trauma that's involved in all this, is just to recognize that there's other things at play that need to happen that are more important than some sort of philosophical answer. And sometimes those might be as simple as just, the presence of human to human, and what the Judeo-Christian community calls lament, like just make space for the acknowledging, at an experiential level, what's going on. And we did that. We actually devoted a whole episode to that whole perspective. And so I think that's important to note. And then beyond the fact that sometimes it's just not helpful to kind of spout out answers, I think we also just kind of need to admit that sometimes, I'm not sure there really is an answer, right, in the sense that, there's a mystery to this. And we all just need to be a little cautious about anybody who says, oh, great, you got 5 minutes, I'll give you the answer to the problem of suffering, because there's a kind of humility that we want to bring to this and acknowledge, we're not the first ones to wrestle with this. We don't pretend to sort of have answers. And really, the best we might hope for is say, how are we going to get at a response to this? Because this is, in fact, a problem. It's called the problem of suffering for a reason.
It's a problem.
For centuries, since the beginning of time, everyone wrestles with this. And so that's kind of important, because I think sometimes it gets sort of thought of as a Christian problem. Like, how are those Christians going to answer about their God and this suffering thing? It's like, well, that's a good question. But also what's a good question is that how is every human being going to grapple with this? And it turns out that we all do. One way or another, everyone comes up with some way to get through life, putting some pieces together. Every religion in the world, every philosophy in the world, including atheism, has to deal with the problem of suffering in some kind of way or other. So the question isn't just, how do those Christians solve it, but how are we going to make sense of this? How are we going to come up with something that reasonably puts pieces together that I can live with? And then I can compare the Christian, set of responses with another one at that point. But we all are choosing some perspective or another.
I think one of the ways to sum up the perspective, the big idea for today is, who are you going to trust? Given that suffering and evil are what they are, which way are you going to trust? Which way are you going to choose to respond to it? And that's what we're interested in talking about today.
Yeah, it's really relevant. Luke, just this last week I saw a headline in a news cycle, it came on social media, about a very prominent Christian leader. I think he was a musician and speaker and this kind of thing, who kind of came out and said, I don't believe in God anymore. And you pressed into it a little bit and read a little bit about it. He said, just when I see suffering in the world, I can't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. So this isn't, this is real. And he's not the first one I've heard of who's come to that conclusion. So it's a pretty important topic we're trying to get at.
And if I'm thinking about I'll say the logic or the pathway that maybe led to that conclusion, it's a pathway that I've gone down myself that I think other people have as well. Maybe I think it unfolds in a way that's kind of like this. You first understand life hurts. Bad things happen. Everyone can see that. There's no denying it. We all experience that. And then the next thing is we don't observe that there's any God that seems to be making it any better. Like God is not somehow making life work the way that we want it. And we have an idea of God, maybe we grew up with, maybe in church or not, but he does miraculous things. He heals, there's calming of storms and parting of seas and people being cured of diseases and all of those things. We look around and we don't see any of those kind of things happening. And we don't, if God was really acting in the ways that God is supposed to act, the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. Tsunamis wouldn't have happened and all of these evil things. And that's just kind of a natural, just an observation that we might make.
Yeah. So I think, Luke, if I can jump in there, I think so this progression you're building, life kind of hurts sometimes, and I don't see God doing anything about it. What's often behind that is an assumption that if anything bad happens, immediately there is a challenge to the existence of God. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that from Christians and non-Christians alike, who will say things like, I can't believe I had this bad thing happen, this bad thing happened. It's like, if you believe in God, you say, well, God must really be after me. Or if I don't believe in God, I say, see, that proves God doesn't exist. But the common assumption between those two is that bad stuff can't coexist with God, because we have this understanding. We either grew up with it or it was rammed down our throat, or we just have a conception of God that, if something bad happens, that can't square up with God. And so either I have to deny my horrible reality, or I say, well, this little God that I've been handed must not exist. And I think this is the conclusion a lot of people draw.
And so that must mean then, in the face of suffering, we're left to fend for ourselves. If we want to stop the hurt, if we want to make the world better, then we're clearly fending for ourselves. And it leads to this idea that, this world is all there is. Whatever we heard about the supernatural clearly is wrong or doesn't exist. And so this world is all there is. We've got to do the best we can to make it better and do something about this terrible thing of suffering, which it is terrible.
You pull the curtain back and turns out there's no God there. And so we're on our own here, y'all. And so historically, philosophically, it kind of leads to one of a couple paths. One is, oh my goodness, we're on our own and we're all screwed, and just give up. There's nothing here. That's despair, nihilism, existentialism, it's called, the kind of angst. Writers like John Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche and others, we're on our own and there's no hope, perhaps. Another is more popular, I think, these days, Luke, is, hey, we're on our own here. So everybody rally together and be on your best behavior, and let's do some stuff because we can do it. We can make this thing work. And I think that's another conclusion. But either way, there is no God. We're on our own.
Yeah, that's kind of the outworking then, is we're trusting ourselves now to get it done. We're trusting human progress, that maybe there's some innate goodness in humans, that we could get together and produce a better world, a more tolerable world. If we work hard enough, we can reform humans enough. Well, whatever approach we're going to take, through whether it's politics or moral teaching or more PSAs or more celebrities getting together and do it. I mean, somehow we could pool that trust in ourselves and make life worth living. We don't need all that religion stuff. We can discard all of that. And what we've ended up with is a trust in ourselves to get it done in the face of suffering. I mean, so that's kind of how I've observed that progression play out.
Progression kind of moves that way. And there are some things that I think are thrown in there, Luke, to sort of make that case. When you look and you see people band together and do something good, humanity, you say things like, even we believe in humanity again.
Mhm.
And there's a beautiful side to that, where people clean up a neighbor after they, a fire at the house or something. But that expansion of that idea is what you're pointing out, is that ultimately, if that's all there is that really a tenable position? So let's unpack, let's go into that a little bit. If that's where we land, there bad things happen, there is no God, we're on our own here, but we can do it. So if the existence of suffering, sometimes used then as a way to say there is no God, what can we say about that?
Yeah, a few observations. One is, just as someone would say there's evidence, it points to evidence that there's no God, I think just as strongly as the claim that it points to the fact that there is a God. And what I mean is, if you're saying there's no God, the natural world is all there is, meaning this natural world is a reality where strong things evolve and adapt and weak things diminish and die, then I think you have a hard time accounting for our outrage and our sorrow over injustice. So what would make us so upset about the stronger overcoming the weak, right? Where does that sense of justice come from? Which we talked about in previous episodes, about the transcendent pull of justice. It seems to suggest that there's something more. There's someone to whom we are accountable, someone or something that can't be explained just within the context of the natural world or just demonstrated empirically. There is that pull, like some kind of higher standard, I guess, when we start aching over suffering or having a sense that it shouldn't be this way.
And it's universal, Luke. It's like every culture, every time in history, you see something, horrible suffering of a child, and everybody kind of says, "Wait, that's not right."
Right.
Well, that's the sense of justice. And so this question of where does that come from? Who gets to say whether that's right or not? How would we know?
Yeah, and I think when you land that there is no God, I think you struggle to find a reference point for, if you're going to say what happened to that child is awful, from which perspective, or where is the standard that determines if it was awful or not, if you're going to discount the supernatural. And you know, we know things aren't right now, and it's like, well, so there's no God that seems to be making it better, so I guess I'll just do it myself. And then so it leads you into that confidence in humanity, right? And so, Nietzsche concludes there is no God, or God is dead, right? And in place of that, there is kind of this calling to be this noble and courageous, self-fashioning person. And then you have to ask, well, noble according to what? Or courageous according to what? There is some, it would seem, some transcendent standard. And so what I think, God is not dead, but in our place is us. We've put ourselves in the place of God. The same faith and authority that we used to put in our idea of God is now vested within ourselves. And that's where that trust thing is really important.
Self becomes the ultimate reference point in this view. It's important to recognize that. It's an option you can choose, but you need to know what you're choosing. It's not a matter of saying it's either God or no God. It's that there's that God or I'm God.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the actual sort of choice. Or at the end of the day, you don't get to put your faith, like I'm gonna have faith and do the Christian thing, or I'm not gonna have faith and I'm just gonna trust in human goodness. Like, wait, did you hear what you just said there? Because you actually are putting your trust or faith in human goodness. So everyone's got to have faith kind of in something here, whether you want to or admit it or not. So the person who says, I don't believe in God because all this suffering in the world, is really at that point choosing to transfer faith to themselves.
And I think then you've got to ask, is that reasonable? Meaning, is it wise? Like, is that a smart move to make? Does it make the most sense to place confidence in oneself or to place confidence in humanity collectively to do what needs to be done about suffering? Because again, as we're going to see in a minute, that's the Bible's interest, is to say this is what's being done about suffering by this God that the Bible is trying to introduce us to. So the alternative then, to say we're going to place our confidence in humanity, I mean, is that a smart thing? Another way, and there's maybe a lot more that we could say about this. I'm not the super well read in the whole regard here, but another way of reading history leading up to the Holocaust, for example, is just to say there was this sweeping attitude of trusting in human progress to get us to a better world that ended up producing 2 world wars, among other things. And so, just, I mean, as one example, and there's countless others that we could point to that just would at least cause us to question the wisdom of placing so much confidence in humanity as an alternative to trusting in God in the face of suffering.
Yes, and I think there's so many examples from history of where in post-enlightenment we were all full of ourselves and we were so sure that human progress was going to mark the change of the world, and there was optimism, and we were going to bring in even God's kingdom, or we're going to bring in the world. And then you had a world war, you had the Russian Revolution, you had all this stuff that it's like as if the sort of resounding answer back to the sort of arrogant attitude of humanity that we're going to solve everything was, how's that working out for you? So that has been kind of proven historically to be an answer. With your Nazi example, was a graphic one, but it's not the only one. It's like every time we try to sort of assume we've got it, I'm not sure you can point to any extended human examples that bear that out.
And there's another thing when you think about looking for answers in the face of suffering. If you were going to assume that if there were an answer to that I would know it, that's actually placing a pretty high degree of confidence in ourselves as well, and our cognitive ability to assume that if an answer existed, I would know it right now. I mean, I'm not sure that that's the best assumption. Yeah. And it's kind of like,
sorry, Luke.
No, go ahead.
I think on the one level, it's a rejection of mystery. We are humans sometimes just absolutely categorically reject something we can't get our arms neatly around. And part of that is our scientific legacy. We like to explain things. And if something's not explicable, I might be tempted to reject it. And I think the problem of suffering is one of those categories that just refuses to go into a neat little box. And that's one reason people just might have trouble. But the other, is to say, almost as if to say, if I were God, I wouldn't do things that way. Right. And therefore, I'm having trouble. I don't like that God. And if
I were God, here's the way I would run the world. I would intervene with divine power at these times and in these ways, and then I would acquiesce to human agency in these situations, right? And so that's to assume that you're able to have the right kind of judgment that would govern the world, right? It's like if I was God, I would do it differently. Is one of the things is kind of operating underneath that conclusion that the existence of suffering demonstrates there is no God.
Yeah, and I just might quickly kind of add to that then, Luke, is to say, I think it takes an unusually high degree of confidence in oneself to make a statement like that. To essentially say, if I were God, this is actually what I would do, and because the God that is running things is doing it wrong. And by the way, the Bible's answer to that from a Christian perspective, again, is to remind humans, I know it's going to seem that way, but just don't forget you don't have access to all knowledge. This is a mystery bigger than human understanding. God says things like, my ways are not your ways. You don't always get to see and know everything about everything. And it leads us back down to that place we don't like, which you're suggesting, Luke, is that at the end of the day, you have to trust something. And so the Bible's answer is, you're going to have to trust me on this one. Not that God's pulling strings on us, but that there's more than we can potentially understand about everything. So, and even I would just say, if you were God, someone might say, if I were God, I might make a list of things that would not exist. And there wouldn't, if I were God, there wouldn't be suffering. There wouldn't be children without shoes. There wouldn't be cancer. There wouldn't be dictators. There wouldn't be racism. And then, so just logically to play that out, like, let's see what's reasonable here. Like, really? So I'm wondering, how would you pull that off exactly? Would you have people on this planet, or would you have robots?
Sure.
And if you had people, how is it that you would manage that balance between allowing them to exercise their will and you controlling everything? So you're pointing out really something very, very important here, Luke. The idea that God's asleep at the wheel, is doing a bad job, is someone that should be fired on the job, is a lot of confidence that you could do it better yourself. I have questions about that.
I think so. Let's move to a place, and admittedly, we're pastors. We've placed our confidence with the God that we meet in the Bible. And so let's look there at the alternative held out to us in the Bible as a place that you could put your trust in the face of suffering. We made an important point last week, I think, when we said the Bible doesn't say so much explaining why suffering exists, but it does talk about what God is doing about it. And what we discover is, even if the Bible doesn't give us the answers we want in exactly the right way that we want them, it doesn't mean it has nothing to give us. The Bible is a very rich resource for the sufferer. And so let's just try to single out some of those things. What is held out to us in the Bible, and what do we learn about what God is doing about suffering? Mm-hmm. So maybe just starting at the beginning, the Bible shows us what good is in terms of having a reference point for knowing what is good. The Bible roots that for us and talks about what's beautiful and right and true and pure. One way to sum it up real quickly: living in harmony with God, yourself, others, in the world, right? That's the good, beautiful thing God created. And
the other thing the Bible says then is that suffering and evil is not good.
Right.
It sort of interrupts that beautiful relationship with God and with the nature and the world and others around us. So it's not part of the design. So it kind of explains, what it is. It's opposed to the purposes of God.
And God is introduced as the ruler of this thing. He set this up. He created it. He breathed it into existence. He installed humans on this earth to have a role. And so while it paints God in that role, it also exposes the suffering and evil that result when humans try to take that role, when they try to rule the world on their own. I mean, you don't have to read very far into the story of the Bible to just see the same song played over and over again when humans say, I kind of want to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to rule things on my own here. And things spin out of control rather quickly. And all of those things of beauty, of, harmony with God and with other people and with the world that God created, they all get disrupted and they're all thrown into chaos. And there's just trouble like crazy that has now infected the whole world. And so it does say some things about how do we account for the evil and the pain of the world? And there's more that we could say about that aspect of the story. But enter then God, who says, I'm going to do something about that. God's not like blind to it. He's not just a distant clockmaker that doesn't care if his world spins out of control. No, he very much cares about it. And he shows up to say, I'm going to do something about it. And he chooses a rather patient approach. We might quibble with how he chooses to do it, but he makes a promise to say, I'm going to bless the world. I'm going to heal the world. And he makes a promise to one man, and through whom he will bless the whole world. And that's kind of how the story unfolds throughout the Old Testament. So it points us to a God who is doing something about it. And then, Ben, flash forward, that's kind of how it starts. Flash forward to the end, when God says, hey, don't forget, I am the king here. I am ruling things. Let me show you how bad it is when you try to rule things. But don't worry, I'm going to get things back on track, bring blessing and healing to the world, and bring it to a reality where my rule ultimately does have the final say. You get a picture of that in the Bible as well.
It gives us a snapshot of the end of the story, and it's pretty cool. And it actually is a place that's described very expressly as without suffering,
right,
and without tears, without pain, without separation. Literally everything you could say about what's wrong with the world today, the Bible says one day God sort of puts all that to rights by bringing, as we would say, kind of heaven to earth, if you will. So that's where we're going. We knew where we started, and we got this middle time that's kind of messed up.
And in that middle time, God shows up bearing the suffering. And that's what we see in Jesus. Every time we talk on this podcast, Ben, we always bring it down to Jesus. That's which says something.
You're getting predictable.
Yeah, I know, but that's kind of our whole reference point for how we account for reality and how we interpret what's going on in the world. And you see the cross at the center of what is happening in the story that God is writing. He's experienced suffering. He knows what suffering is like. He's borne it himself. But it's not just that he knows what suffering is like, because the Bible doesn't just show us the cross, it shows us the empty tomb, it shows us God redeeming suffering. And so the resurrection, which is that ultimate fulfillment for God to bless the world, right? God is doing that through Jesus to bring blessing and healing to the entire world. And it acts as that down payment on the future reality that we've talked about, that you just described here. It shows us a God who's saying, I'm doing something about it. And so you see Jesus suffering. you see the way God's redeeming it and overcoming evil and handling the real problem of suffering. That is, that's what we're talking about in the first place. And you realize that the way that God is doing something about that suffering makes a difference in how he's doing something about suffering and evil of all kinds. So what we find in the Bible is it doesn't necessarily say why every kind of suffering happens, but what it does announce boldly is that nothing can stop God from transforming suffering into glory. He did it for Jesus. He'll do it for us. That's what the Bible holds out for us. The resurrection, it's not giving us an answer exactly to where evil comes from, but it does say that nothing can stop God from defeating evil and eradicating it from the new world that he's bringing about. Okay, that's what is shown to us in the resurrection. It doesn't say how long we're going to have to endure the pain, but it's very loud about the fact that nothing is going to stop God from being present with those who suffer, from giving them strength in the moment, and that even in the hardest, rockiest, difficult, most challenging places, nothing can stop God from bearing the fruit of new creation, right? Of love and joy and peace, even in the most difficult places. We see God redeeming suffering. And that kind of puts us in that now but not yet reality that the Bible also helps us see. Talk maybe as a place to close, Ben, just kind of talk about that reality.
I just think it's the only thing, Luke, that I've ever come across that to me makes sense of the ugliness of the world and still gives you hope for the future, because it doesn't rely upon me or you to sort of be on good behavior to pull this thing together.
Right.
It's the only thing I've ever run across. And whether you're talking about every other world religion, you chase it down and look, and I'm not here to criticize any other world religion. I'm just saying, if I'm dying here, I'm going to choose the paddle that's going to get me off this island. And to me, the kingdom of God, that now but not yet, it shows us a God who knows suffering, has experienced suffering himself and gone through it in order to end it, as if to say, I want my planet back. Right. What's happening now is not okay. We're not just supposed to avoid it or ohm our way through it. We're supposed to acknowledge
pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that it doesn't exist. It's very painful. And Jesus says, I know. And I'll take and bear that suffering so that we can have the hope of all of this coming back together again. And then he says, in the meantime, I'm with you every minute. And how about you get busy? Now we can put the human efforts to work, not just on our own strength, but infused and guided by his own presence to work towards something that he guarantees the outcome of. Yeah. I'm all about that. And that's a little more than maybe we were looking for there. But
it's not, and I know we're going long here, it's not just pie in the sky. It's not just about what will happen. If you talk to anyone who has drawn closer to God in their suffering, they will talk to you about the ways that God has fulfilled promises to them in the here and now. It doesn't mean that they've been healed miraculously or that they never went through anything hard. In fact, Jesus talks quite explicitly about, in this world you will face trouble. Okay, you're going to be wounded by the shrapnel of this broken place. But anybody who has moved toward God in suffering, instead of running away from God, they will talk to you about the ways, and I can talk about the ways that God has fulfilled his promises and has offered made a this worldly kind of impact in my life. And through that suffering, it's not just about some day to come, even though it is very much about that too. So
we began with the story of a man who looked at suffering in his own life in the world and concluded there is no God. To someone who's listening, who's trying to make sense of your own pain, I would say another reasonable conclusion is, I'm so glad there is a God. There must be a God, because there's no way we could get through this on our own. We're going to dive in maybe next week to a little bit deeper to sort of what is some of the response that the Bible brings. I'll look forward to that episode as well.
Talk about that. Remember, sending questions, 6feet@mountaincc.org. And we hope you'll join us next time for another episode of 6 Feet Apart.